What a great song that is. We're looking at Psalm 23 for the next couple of weeks. Well, not next week. Remember, next week is Mother's Day, and I'll have a special message on the family and also a gift and recognition for our moms. So today, Psalm 23, and then we'll pick back up in 2 weeks. Today, let's read verses 2 through 4 today of this great psalm. Psalm 23. We looked some at verse 2, let's read, but I have a few more comments to make, so let's start there in verse 2. He says, He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Let's stop there. One of the things I love about this psalm is that it gives us a way of thinking about God and about life. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, a man is what he thinks about all day long. The Roman statesman Marcus Aurelius said, a man's life is what his thoughts make it. In more recent times, Norman Vincent Peale said, change your thoughts and change your world. Now, they were all basically paraphrasing what the book of Proverbs told us 3,000 years ago. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. In other words, what you think about is what you become. This psalm gives us a way of thinking about God and about life that if we'll put it into practice, it will change our lives. So let's look a little more deeply into this beautiful psalm this morning. I want to touch just briefly again upon this phrase, He makes me to lie down in green pastures, because it's connected to verse 3. And verses 3 and 4 are our main text for today. Verse 3 says that God restores the shepherd restores our souls. But quite often before God can restore our souls, He has to make us lie down in green pastures. A lot of people never hear from the Lord because they're never quiet long enough to hear His voice. They're never still long enough to hear God's voice, or they look for God in the wrong places. You remember that Elijah looked for God in the whirlwind. He looked for God in the fire. He couldn't find Him. It was only when he went to the mouth of the cave and he heard God whisper to him in that still small voice. Moses saw the burning bush when he was way out on the backside of a desert in the wilderness. Paul was on the lonely, quiet road to Damascus when he saw Jesus. Remember that Jesus told his disciples just before his ascension, and just before they were to carry the gospel out to the world, he told them to tarry in Jerusalem and wait in prayer for the power of God. My experience over the years has been a lot of Christians will do anything for the Lord except wait on the Lord. They'll do anything for the Lord except be quiet before Him. They'll work for God. They'll sing for God. They'll teach for God. They'll even preach for Him. They'll sacrifice and suffer for the Lord. But they will not wait on the Lord. And they will not be still before the Lord. And sometimes people have to actually get sick before they'll be quiet and be still before the Lord. I'm struck by the wording of that phrase, that He makes me lie down in green pastures. Don't think God won't do it. And don't make Him do it. Don't make Him have to make you be still. You need to be taking some time every day to be still and quiet before the Lord. And worship is one of the most fundamental and important ways that we do that. And this emphasis on spiritual rest that he's making here is, I told you this psalm gives us a way of thinking about God and a way about thinking about life, this is a very healthy theological understanding of how we do Christian work. All of our activity for God comes out of our waiting before God, comes of our resting in God. That's where our activity comes from. A lot of Christians, a lot of churches have this backwards. All of the emphasis is on activity, on meetings and budgets and buildings and all the rest of it. And they forget about the most fundamental, important reason that the Lord left us here to begin with, and that is to worship Him. Nothing that you do during the week is more important than worship. And when I say nothing, I mean that literally. Nothing that you do in the week is more important than worshiping the Lord. And so he begins by saying he makes me lie down in green pastures. And that leads to the next phrase in verse 3, he restores my soul. I talked last week about we live in all the personal stress that we face as individuals. But it's not just personal stress. We live in stressful times. We live in a stressful world. I was reading something and preparing for this message. I read something from a Lutheran theologian by the name of Joseph Sittler. He said something I'd never really thought about before. He said that the music of every era reflects the times in which the music was written. And he gives Handel, who wrote the Messiah, as an example. Handel lived in the mid-18th century in England. It was a very quiet time. It was a peaceful time. And he writes this, that in the well-ordered years of 18th century England, Handel wrote his music. And he said, because of that, you hear in his music the lovely melodies, the beautiful harmonies, and the quiet strains of the woodwinds. Now he said, over against that, what is the music of today? It's, a lot of it anyway, it's chaotic, it's violent, it's profane. It's a reflection of the world we live in. Have you ever thought about that? That's the world that you and I live in every day of our lives. We live in a stressful, chaotic world. And in the midst of all of that, we've got cities burning in our country right now. But in the midst of all of this chaos, the political and social and cultural upheaval, the 23rd Psalm reminds us that the Good Shepherd restores our soul. I think he has a couple of things in mind here. Part of this is that spiritual refreshing that we should be experiencing every day of our lives. I was reading some books about sheep and shepherds preparing for this brief series of messages. I read that every morning the shepherd, before the sun rises, he takes his sheep out into the fields to graze. And the sheep do an unusual thing. They form themselves in a line. And they all eat there in the line. And the shepherd stands back and watches over them. He scans the field for danger while they're eating. And during the day, one by one, the sheep will leave the line and they come back to the shepherd. And they'll come up and they'll nuzzle him, and he rubs their heads and behind their ears and whispers to them and reassures them. And they turn around and go back and resume their place in the line and continue to eat. Now, David, as a shepherd, would have experienced that from the point of view of the shepherd. And part of what he has in mind here, this restoring of the soul, I think, is about that. It's about that, sheep are timid animals. And I love it that when the sheep leaves the line to come up to the shepherd for reassurance, the shepherd doesn't scold the sheep for his timidity. He doesn't mock the sheep for being a scaredy cat. He reassures him. That renewal, that refreshing, that restoring of confidence in the relationship, that's part of what the Good Shepherd does for us as we seek him day to day. But there's something else here, too, that I see here. Part of this is the restoration of the wayward sheep. Sometimes a sheep will wander off. You remember Jesus told a parable about that in Luke 15 about the man who had 100 sheep and one wanders off. I've read that when sheep wander off, sometimes they will fall over. They'll fall into a ravine, or they lose their footing. A lot of these paths in Palestine, they're up on mountains. And the sheep will fall over and get on its back. And do you know when a sheep falls on its back, it can't right itself? I didn't know that. But a sheep falls on its back, it's stuck there. And of course now it's vulnerable to vultures and wolves and lions and whatever else is in the area. And that's why it's so urgent that the shepherd go and find it. And when he finds it, he can't just flip it over and the sheep runs off by itself. They have a very delicate equilibrium inside. And so when he finds the sheep on its back, he takes it and very gently sets it over onto its side. And it has to stay there for a few minutes until its insides get right. And then it helps the sheep stand up, but even then it's not ready to go off on its own, so he stands the sheep upright and he straddles it, he stands over it, and he rubs the sheep's head and rubs its side and whispers into its ear. And this takes a few minutes until the sheep is ready to go off and have that second chance at life. David was an old man when he wrote this psalm. This psalm, even though it comes before Psalm 51 in the order of the book of Psalms, it was written later. Psalm 51, of course, is David's great psalm of repentance. David knew what it was to mess up, to go off track, to go off the path, and to be restored, to get back up. You know, sometimes the Lord's sheep need to be restored like that. All too often in church life, man, we shoot our wounded. You know, somebody falls and we're done with them. Like they're of no more value to the Lord anymore, that they can't be of use anymore, they're no good anymore. I love this, that the shepherd, when he finds that fallen sheep, he doesn't curse him for falling. He gets him back up, restores him along the way. God is so much more merciful than we are. A lot of Christians who have fallen will have that notion that God is disgusted with us now and through with us, ready to cast us aside. And that's why the imagery of the sheep and the shepherd here is so important to us. Have you ever thought about how much time Jesus spent with the outcasts of life, the down and out, those people for whom society had no need? Or I think about Jesus when he met with Peter. This was just before Peter was going to betray Jesus, which Jesus already knew. And do you remember the words that Jesus spoke to him? This is in Luke 22. He says to him, or he doesn't say, I can't believe you would betray me. After all I've done for you, as good as I've been to you, I can't believe that you would do that to me. No. What he says is, Peter, when you have repented, and the King James says converted there, but it's the word for repent. Peter, when you've repented, strengthen your brothers. He saw past that fall to a place where Peter could be of service again. And there's a beautiful message of hope in this, that the Good Shepherd is always ready to restore us when we repent. And so he says, he restores my soul. And then look also in verse 3, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. There is a sequence of thought that's going on in this psalm. The green pastures and the still waters lead to the restoration of the soul. And the restoration of the soul leads to walking in the paths of righteousness. You know, like sheep, we are prone to go off on our own. We will wander off on our own. We're all prone to that. And I've read that sheep have no sense of direction. You can take a horse, a cow even, a dog or a cat, and if they get lost, they can usually find their way home. There's stories about dogs traveling across country to get back home. But evidently, once a sheep is lost, that's it. It's lost. It can't find its way back. Now, how do we keep from doing that? How do we keep from getting so far gone that we can't find our way back? Well, look at what he says in verse 3. It says that he leads us in the paths of righteousness. Two problems that sheep have that the shepherd needs to know about. One is that sheep are notorious creatures of habit. They'll just keep following the same path going down and not really knowing where they're going, not caring where they're going. And so the shepherd knows this and has to keep an eye on them. And also sheep have very poor eyesight. They evidently can only see about 10 or 15 yards up ahead. And so they may not be aware of the dangers that are out there. And I think there's a message here that to remind us that left to our own devices, we are all prone to wandering off. And so he reminds us that we are not alone, that the shepherd watches over us. And he leads the sheep into the paths of righteousness. He doesn't drive them. You can't drive sheep like cows. You can stand, a cowboy can stand behind a herd of cows and whoop and holler and make noise and shoot off his guns and all that, and cows will get going. You can herd cows. You can't do that with sheep. You have to go in front of them because sheep have to be led. But listen to this. There is one amazing quality that sheep have. In most ways, they are not impressive animals, but there is one amazing quality that sheep have. And that is they'll follow their shepherd wherever he leads them. And evidently they can distinguish their shepherd's voice. I read a story of 3 shepherds to test this who went into a corral, and then they put sheep from each of their flocks into the corral, but just mixed them up, And then the 3 shepherds stood at 3 different points and called out to their sheep, and every one of the sheep found their own shepherd. There's no need to brand them. They know whose they are. They respond to the shepherd's voice. And sheep know, for whatever defects they have or inadequacies they have, they know that if they follow their shepherd, they're on the right path. Now, do you see where I'm going with that? How that applies to your life? Sometimes you may be wondering, are you doing things right? Are you on the right path in life? Well, let me tell you, when you're following the shepherd, the answer is yes. You may not see it, you may not always know it, you may not always believe it. And so remember this, when you follow the shepherd, you are on the right path. Have you come to the place in your life yet where you really believe that you can trust the Good Shepherd with your life? Because you can. And do you know that if you will let God be your shepherd, he will guide you in every area of your life? The book of Proverbs says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. That's Proverbs 3:6, and that is a promise from God to you. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So wherever your path leads you in life, don't be afraid if you're following the Good Shepherd. And then last point, in verse 4, he says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. It's at this point in the psalm, which is about the halfway point, that it shifts from third person, in other words, talking about the Good Shepherd, to first person, talking to the Good Shepherd. You won't notice the switch unless you're really paying attention. But do you see what he says? He doesn't say, I will fear no evil, for the shepherd is with me. Now he's talking directly to the shepherd, and he says, for you are with me. You read this psalm and you read about the wonderful blessings of the still waters and the green pastures, and you may assume, well, that's the blessing that the shepherd gives the sheep, but that's not it. It's not the main blessing anyway. Verse 4 says that we eventually all walk through the valley of the shadow of death. We're all going there. There is an actual valley in Palestine called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. I didn't know that until this week. It is a mountainous path that leads from the Dead Sea to the city of Jerusalem. It is a precarious path high up in the mountains. It is narrow. and dangerous. And the danger is that the sheep may fall at any moment. But when the sheep walk through this path, they're not afraid. Why? Well, what does David say? Because you are with me. They're not afraid because the shepherd is there. And it's at these high places, dangerous places, that the contact, the connection between the sheep and the shepherd is at its closest. That's when the shepherd is paying the most attention, because the danger is the greatest. And so the sheep says, I will not fear, for you are with me. Now, David knew as a shepherd all of the dangers of that place of life, that mountainous path. But he knew the sheep didn't need to fear, because wherever they went, he went. Whatever danger they faced, he was there. Notice, it's not that the valley of the shadow of death isn't scary necessarily. It might be. It's that you're not alone when you go there. And notice that you don't stop in the valley of the shadow of death. You go through it. Did you see that? He says, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the wonderful thing for a Christian. That's why there is no fear of death, not ultimately, because we're just passing through it. The great Presbyterian preacher Donald Barnhouse wrote in one of his books about the death of his wife. His wife passed away when his children were quite young. And he said he had no idea how he was going to explain her death to them in a way that would make sense. And he said, as he and his boys were driving back from the funeral to go back home, a large truck passed by on the side of them. And the shadow of that truck passed over their car. And he said, I had a thought. And I said to my boys, would you rather be run over by a truck or by the shadow of a truck? And they said, well, we'd rather be run over by the shadow of a truck, because the shadow of a truck can't hurt us. And he said, that's what happened to Mom. She was just passed over by the shadow of death. We don't stop there. It's a doorway for us as we walk through. When we know Jesus, we're coming out on the other side. And so he says, there is no fear, for you are with me, even in the valley of the shadow of death. The constant in this psalm is not the green pastures. They come and go in life. It's not the still waters. They come and go. The constant in the psalm is not the valley of the shadow of death. That's waiting for all of us, but we all walk through that. The only constant in the 23rd Psalm is the presence of the shepherd. Wherever we go, whatever we go through, he is with us. This morning we're going to sing hymn number 450 as our song of invitation. Hymn number 450, I Need Thee Every Hour. Let's stand together as we sing.